the meeting uploaded for everybody to see. So I am going to share screen and bring up Professor Roland's talk. Not that one, just bear with me. This is where my expertise in sharing screen needs to be a little bit more slick. Here we go. I'm hoping now you've got a full-size slide filling the screen.
Yep.
Lovely. Over to you, Damien. Thank you.
Welcome all. Thank you very much for inviting me. I get a chance to channel my inner Chris Whitty as we're doing that slide moving on remotely. I am a paediatric emergency medicine consultant, head of service of the Leicester Royal Infirmary Children's Emergency Department and the NHS England lead for the deteriorating child. I've been involved in the SPOT programme, and the SPOT programme, system-wide paediatric observation tracking, is a programme of work to look at addressing challenges of recognizing and responding to deterioration, regardless of where you are as a child, anywhere in England, whether that's hospital, out of hospital and community. And we have started with a national PEWS, or a standardized national PEWS. But as I will reiterate towards the end of this presentation, the national PEWS is only the start. So we will have an inpatient chart, but we are also thinking about EDP, hospital, community, etc., as time goes on. So if we can move on. So the background to why this is important is report after report after report after report demonstrates that there are things that you could have done to have intervened earlier to prevent death and morbidity in children. Now, one of the challenges for England is if we compare England to other European countries of similar GDP, social and ethnic mix, we have poorer outcomes, particularly for asthma, but for other conditions as well. And there are a variety of reasons for that, but one is a particular concern about our ability to escalate in a meaningful and effective manner. So, next slide. Now, PEWS are not a new thing, and by PEWS I'm talking about paediatric early warning scores at this point, and essentially if whatever system you have that is looking at physiology, assigning it a number, and then the higher or lower the number is how it determines how much you escalate. That's brilliant if it monitors effectively and flags up deteriorating kids. But I think over time, a lot of people became increasingly frustrated by the fact that it was just draining resources with no clear benefit and would still fail to recognize deterioration. So if we move on, next slide. And this created this problem whereby I think PEWS developed a bit of a bad name. And one of the challenges is that people were far too quick to think about the score rather than the system. So pediatric early warning systems as a methodology of changing culture, reducing hierarchy, allowing people to speak up, considering other human factors other than just some numbers on a sheet of paper. So if we go, move on. And there is a particular dichotomy which we are trying to fix, is the difference between a child's score and the child you see in front of you. So it is possible for the child's score to be through the roof, but you looking at a child going, well, actually, this kid's not too bad, and vice versa, the child's score being very low, but you being extremely concerned about what needs to happen to that child. Next slide. And we have known for absolutely ages that it is not just about the score. So you will hear me, and feel free to correct me if I interchange score and system incorrectly. But it is the system that is the most important, because you not only have to recognize deterioration, you have to empower staff, have the appropriate response, have a timely intervention, and only then will you improve outcomes. Next slide. And I'm becoming more and more aware of this. It's not really about deterioration now as well. It's about acuity or dependency being recognized. So it's about where is the right patient for this to be of a particular clinical level. And ICU have had a challenge in the fact that there is limited capacity of level 2 HDU type beds. We have lots of children who present to our ED who probably don't need critical care, but they are too unwell for the ward, and where do they go? And we need a standardized way of approaching that. And then I'm just going to call it out. So we can talk about empowered staff until we're blue in the face, but if you don't have enough staff on the ward, it doesn't matter what you've got available to you. You are always going to run into difficulty. Next slide. One of the interesting things is, having done a significant amount of research in this over the last decade, that the biggest RCT, or randomized controlled trial, that's been done specifically on PEWS, next slide, actually didn't find a difference in mortality. And Chris Parshuram from Canada was very blunt in his conclusion. He said you cannot use PEWS for the sole purpose of reducing mortality. And what he was calling out there was our obsession with mortality as an only outcome measure. Next slide. And there has been quite a significant amount of research in the, I suppose, pediatric PEWS academic community about trying to say, look, we need to measure other things. It's not just about mortality. And next slide. There's a number of studies, some looking at effectiveness, some looking at not, but they nearly all say that there are secondary benefits: communication, teamwork, empowerment of junior staff. There is a real strong case for standardization as a way of improving these soft factors, even if mortality isn't the overall gain. Next slide. And we already also know that while we've in England have a different PEWS in virtually every hospital in the country, Scotland have moved towards a national process, so have Northern Ireland, as have Queensland and Australia. But if you dig deep into some of these countries which have standardized, I think there are still things which are challenging for them. And I think my Scottish counterparts would be quite honest in saying that while they say they have a national PEWS, it's not completely embedded everywhere, and they still got learning to do on their journey. Next slide. So we set up a group back in 2018. We've been severely hampered by COVID, and we wanted to design a system, an approach which was digitally enabled, education orientated, safety design, that we held ourselves to account on a number of features. Next slide. But ultimately, what we came to the conclusion is we are not going to find the one score. We're not going to find the one ring that binds everything. We need a score that we can find consensus on. And one of the important principles here is that while some hospitals have a Lamborghini or a Ferrari, and some have maybe a more difficult maybe not so good PEWS system, what we're trying to do is put a Volvo basically in every hospital in England. And what that's going to mean is that some hospitals, I'm getting a bit of feedback. Is that, I don't know if it's possible for everyone to mute. Thanks, all. So the difficulty is that in order to go for a standardized process for everyone, some people are maybe going to lose out, but some people will benefit. But that is the benefit for more children overall. Next slide. So we had planned for kind of release end of 2019. We've done chart reviews, data examination, case studies, lots of different stuff. COVID put a bit of a kibosh to that. Next slide. But eventually we got to the point where we had decided that what would contribute to the score would be a number of parameters. And this was from expert consensus, from PICU consultants, general pediatricians, nursing staff, and other specialists in the field. But we would have a chart that would also include some items which must be scored, which must be recorded, but not necessarily scored. Next slide. And with everything that happens, you create some risk. So you can't have a system which mandates everyone does everything, because that becomes overwhelming. But if you miss out the important objectives, then you're not getting something that is granular and can escalate in a timely fashion. Next slide. And so what I want to read through is just a couple of things that kind of forced our thinking, I suppose, and the things that we were keen on doing in reaching the chart that we have done. So as with all things, the moment that you get into a tick box exercise, staff think they're doing it just to get through the process of a particular exercise, you lose any safety perspective. So the PEWS chart must still be a cognitive prompt, and there must still be the ability for staff to do what they think is the right thing, not just, I have done this, this, and that. Next slide. You've heard me mention this a couple of times now, and I will it continues to pain to mention it. A score is very different from a system. We must remove our obsession with a particular number that mandates everything. And until we do that, I don't think we're going to get the full impact of PEWS systems. And I will reinforce later on about where I think that becomes important. Next slide. So we have a PEWS score as part of the chart, but we also have clinical intuition and parent concern, which are independent escalators, i.e., if the score is 0 and the clinical intuition is 0, but the parent is saying, this is the most concerned I have ever been, that must be addressed in some form of escalation pathway. And then we also have some specific concerns, and the two major ones here are sepsis, and also a child who suddenly reduces their conscious level in a short period of time. Next slide. And some of those things that I've mentioned are going to create a huge de-implementation challenge. And the PEWS rollout is about de-implementation rather than implementation. Every hospital in England at the moment essentially already has a PEWS chart. So we're not giving people new things to do, we're changing what they've already done. Next slide. And this is going to bear itself out in a number of ways. There are lots of ways, but here are 5 of the big ones. Next slide. So the first is parent concern. So some hospitals already are doing magnificently with parent concern, but the new chart should allow you to escalate up to the level of, actually, you need to do the 4 2s if a parent is saying, look, no one is listening to me. And clearly people are aware of the recent Martha's law, or probably more correctly, Martha's rule. So this is the sad case of a young girl who died secondary to sepsis, secondary to pancreatic trauma. And a number of concerns were raised, especially about the parents, about teams not communicating well together, and the absence of their ability to have a voice. Now, one of the things is that we should be launching this particular chart today, and one of the reasons that we're not is because we are working through what some of the impact of Martha's rule is going to be, to make sure we are joined up as we possibly can be. Now, for the PEWS, the parent concern is still dependent on the staff. The parent is going to have to go through a staff member to raise their concern. For the case of Martha's rule, that is talking about a parent being able to escalate independent of nursing or junior medical staff. They can make a call directly. And you can see how uncomfortable that might make people feel, but there is evidence to support that approach. Next slide. Oxygen delivery and oxygen saturation. So we have adopted an approach where high flow BiPAP and CPAP will score maximal on the oxygen delivery aspect. There are a lot of people will not like that at all, and they will say that high flow isn't that much of an intervention, and it shouldn't score maximally because that's going to falsely escalate children. The ICU opinion to that is actually high flow is not a unintensive agent, and the unique design of our chart. So if we go to the next slide, and this is, I think, a world first, is that you're able to track oxygen delivery over time. So a lot of current PEWS charts, you just tick whether you've got an oxygen or not. Whether on this chart, even if you score the maximum of 4 points, you can still see if there's an increasing oxygen trend, and you can intervene as appropriately to that. Next slide. And with oxygen saturations, we've kind of flipped the chart around a bit. So you actually go down because that's what happens to saturations. But the other thing that we have done is we are not correcting for children who normally have low sats, such as cardiac disease. Again, a number of sites will really struggle with that because they will say, well, actually, these children have normally low sats, so they shouldn't get an extra score. And again, the expert consensus opinion on that is a reserve that that child is using, and they do need to be highlighted as different. And a number of cases as part of the pilot testing have identified that actually these children, especially in district general hospitals, had the ability to be picked up before they normally would have been. Next slide. Blood pressure. So this has been a real challenge over the last 18 months in the pilot sites. We've really discovered through the PEWS pilot that no one does regular blood pressures, and they find every way out of doing a regular blood pressure, often for very good reason. If your child is going home at 9 o'clock the next morning, should you wake them up at 4 o'clock in the morning just for the sake of recording something on a chart? So we work really hard to ensure that blood pressure is part of the score. It should be done with every observations, but there are a number of mitigations that you can put in to avoid you doing unnecessary testing, as long as you have provided a fail-safe or a mechanism for making sure that that particular blood pressure reading isn't necessary. And then next slide. And finally, we talk about escalation. So what we are moving towards, next slide, is a low, medium and high and emergency response. And those low, medium, high and emergency responses can be either because of the score or because of parent concern or clinical intuition, or because of sepsis concern, etc. Next slide. In terms of presentations then, this is not for you to read. I am clearly, I'm just showing you this slide because there is a range of different interventions for the different risk categories. And one of the, apologies again, there's a bit of background noise. So the big problem for some sites will be, can you get the right medical or nursing response for the right escalation? And again, that's going to push the system, but we're not shying away from that because we need a standard of care throughout England. Next slide. So standardization is what we're aiming for, so everyone does the same thing, but standards do get in the way of that. So there are some standards, for example, for doing blood transfusions. Those blood transfusions come with specific ways of doing the number of observations you need to do, and our standardization kind of will conflict with those blood transfusion standards. We have to be aware of that, and we were going to need to work through over time. I think there are going to have to be special blood transfusion add-ons. We're going to need to think about what happens in day case, what happens in post-operative theatres, etc. And one of the reasons we've not tried to nail all of those problems now is because we just extend the delivery time. What we want is to get the inpatient chart in place and then work outwards. Next chart. No, next slide. I've not even touched on digital, so we're producing a paper chart. We have what we think is an innovative digital specification. So we have released a beta phase manual for providers, which set the minimum standards that you as a provider must do if you want to be able to say that you are giving a national PEWS to a hospital. And the aim of that is to avoid providers gaming the system. If they go, look, we don't want to deliver this, well, actually, the hospital can then say, well, you're not our provider. And it will also centralize some resources so that people can't charge huge sums of money. The future is for every hospital to have digital recording. We're maybe not there as fast as we would like, but we are heading in that direction. Next slide, please. And then this funny quirk of the way that patients work. So I have if we go back one, I've already mentioned that we are not making a alteration for children with low saturations or those perhaps who are normally on oxygen. But we also know that there are patients who have anorexia nervosa, those patients with mental health difficulties, perhaps those patients with severe learning difficulties. And these are going to be a challenge to ingrain in our system. And again, what we're asking people to do is implement the chart, and we will work together. We are going to have monthly community of practice meetings, and we will work through some of these difficulties in making sure that every patient patient, regardless of their background, gets a fair crack at the whip. Next slide. So we're at the very beginning of a journey. So we will be producing this chart shortly, hopefully in the next month or so. But there's a lot of steps to go on in terms of the de-implementation for charts that already exist out for the implementation digitally, to make sure that we are escalating in the right way. And then we need to move out into emergency departments, pre-hospital care, community, etc. Next slide. I would just like to pay testament to nursing staff. The pilot process worked because of the nursing staff embedding this into processes, both practice nurses and clinical nurse leaders. And I think we have a tool which has been piloted at a number of sites, and really both nursing staff and medical staff are very engaged in this being the best it can possibly be. Next slide. There's a huge amount of people who have been involved in this. I can't name everyone, but it has been a hugely collaborative effort. Next slide, and then we're finished. Thank you very much.
Damien, thank you very much. That was a real tour de force through what has obviously been a huge amount of work. I suspect some of that has come from our institution. I know they're really keen on getting PEWS and escalation from PEWS right. That opportunity to intervene before the child gets really, really sick is so important. We do have time for a couple of questions if anyone wants to put something into the chat. I can't see any questions in there at the moment. If any of our speakers want to come online and ask a question, they'd be welcome. We're going to go, but I would ask the rest of the attendees to use the chat if you could. Really great work, Damien. Thank you so much for updating us. I sort of look forward to seeing it in the flesh. We are digital at our institution. You probably know that already, because one of the people you're working with is Professor Simon Kenny, who's one of my colleagues.
Yeah.
And we've had parental concern on our PEWS chart for quite some time. And actually, I've got a very personal incidence of going in to see a child just a couple of weeks ago and having been told, he's okay. And mum looked me in the eye and went, he's not okay. I've never seen him like this. He's always chatty. He always bounces back. He is just not right. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to change my plan. I am going to change my plan. And we do need to intervene here where I had thought we didn't need to, which was absolutely the right thing to do. So parental concern is a massive thing. It's really important. Okay, so no questions have popped into the chat. So once again, thank you very much, Damien. And I will take us on next to Dr. John Burke's presentation. And let me just get their slides up so that we're all ready to go. Sorry, I'm struggling a little bit. I apologize with the slide moving on. My mouse can only be in one place at once, and I can also only I've got a very sensitive touch screen. So just bear with me. I'm nearly there. Let me share my screen, and hopefully John's talk is now available for everybody to see.
Great. Thanks very much. Hi guys, and thanks, Damien. You've certainly set a high bar and stunned us all with no questions, because I think we're also processing what you just said. So my name's John. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at AXA Health, and what I wanted to perhaps achieve today with a short space of time is to perhaps shine a light a little bit on an area of patient safety that I don't think necessarily gets the same limelight as many of the other things, which is the decision processes behind how we decide what healthcare to deliver in the first place in our healthcare institutions. So never mind the sort of downstream processes of trying to analyze whether it's being delivered in a good and safe and effective way, but what are we aiming to deliver in the way of new treatments when they come along and are proposed to be used. And really, to give you a real life example of what I see, which is quite a messy decision making sometimes, because I think any of us could easily analyze a clear randomized controlled trial and decide whether a drug is effective or not in a particular circumstance and use licensing and things. But unfortunately, if only every new technology was that simple. It's not an easy process. And also, from my perspective, in the private sector, I have the luxury of it not being polluted by financial considerations, or however, it is a process that is often mixed up, and various sort of pronouncements about whether things could be used in the NHS are often mixed between evidence for safety and effectiveness with financial considerations. But I'm lucky in my position in private practice to not really have to think about that second arm. The second sort of purpose is really, as I said, to give you a real life experience and my own personal experiences of various players in the system to perhaps take this from less of a theoretical kind of operation to really give you some insight about the challenges that we have. And then finally, hopefully along the way, perhaps give you some insight about robotic assisted surgery. I don't know how much you know or have heard of it. Obviously, there'll probably be somebody on the call that actually does it, but it's a fascinating rise of a very exciting technology. So can I have the next slide? Now, this slide simply shows, the rise of robotic assisted surgery in the UK. And although this graph ends in 2019, let me reassure you it is continuing at pace to today. And you may be forgiven for thinking, well, looking at that, there must be an enormous evidence-based and lots of data suggesting better outcomes for patients. And you might be surprised or not to learn that perhaps that's not necessarily the case. And there are a lot of other factors involved in the introduction of robotic assisted surgery in the UK. Nonetheless, and we can sort of go through those factors in a little bit. Now, for those of you that don't particularly know what it is, it's essentially a piece of a very expensive kit that enables the delivery of minimally invasive surgery by surgeons sitting at a console and being able to control in relative ease and comfort to robotic arms that should be sitting in the same room, in my view, as the surgeon controlling, but technically can actually be around the other side of the world, although any of us with recent Teams experience might shudder at the thought of connectivity and all the problems that might arise. So, and I guess the real prize is twofold. One is the ability perhaps for this technology to deliver more minimally invasive surgery and less open surgery. And the second is perhaps do the minimally invasive surgery better than traditional laparoscopic techniques, although I've alluded before that the evidence is a bit light. Now, talking to hospital groups and specialists involved, the reasons behind introduction of robots into particular hospitals are often not necessarily a huge evidence base about better outcomes and safety. It can often be reputational, the ability to attract new students and new consultants. It can often be a fear of being left behind as robotic surgery becomes more widespread. And as I said, the hope of maybe extending either the operative lives of some surgeons that often go off sick with back pain, etc., from hours bent over laparoscopes, and also the hope that with the ease of training and use of these platforms, maybe some people that can't master laparoscopic surgery could hopefully do that with the assistance of a robot. So can I have the next slide, please? So really, this is a non-exhaustive list of the various institutions and regulators that I've come across in the thought process behind whether, as a private healthcare insurer, we should fund robotic surgery in private hospitals. And as with many things in life, it's really quite an ethical thing between balancing patient autonomy. Often our private customers really do want the latest technology and the things that they read about and the fantastic sort of advertisement pitches that are out there, really combined with their enormous vulnerability in private practice, with the power asymmetries of the information being passed between them and specialists, and you know, the adequacy of consent processes, and really is consent informed, and all kinds of things which I'm sure you're familiar with. And you know, running down this list of potential players, you know, GMC, the ultimate sort of bedrock of our practice, you know, obviously sets rules about, you know, we should do no harm to our patients and act in our patients' best interest. Really have been largely silent in the world of robotics. The MHRA, the medical device regulators, is obviously a huge role to play in deeming these medical devices safe to be within operating theatres, but little comment about what they should be used for. I'm not aware of any CQC report that's particularly examined the sort of nuts and bolts of introduction of robotic surgical programs in particular hospital providers. NICE, which you may think would be the natural repository of you know, evaluations of this kind of technology, apart from some initial, you know, statements around urological surgery and the use of robots which may or may not be used, it has been, you know, largely silent from then on. And Royal Colleges and professional groups, guideline writers, likewise, very little to say apart from perhaps some more recent movement about setting some standards about training and accreditation of surgeons for use for these programs. NHS England, local commissioners, again, really very, very little in the way of publicly accessible statements or bold sort of position statements. And it's really been left to the actual individual provider hospital governance structures really to examine the introduction of robots in individual trusts. In particular, you know, new body technology body boards, you know, perhaps examining the need for increased audit and that kind of thing, but often highly mixed and mixed up with business cases for the individual hospital, financial concerns and all those other things that I alluded to before. And then there's us, the private medical insurance providers, who really do take our duty very seriously to have a look at these new technologies and say, really, are they safe and effective? Should people be having access to them, and should we be paying for access to them? And I mentioned right at the bottom, and I'm more than happy to take questions and explore that further, but you may not have appreciated there is also the financial service regulators involved in our practice, because at the end of the day, private medical insurance is a financial product, and so we're subject to financial services regulation, which produces some counterintuitive things. For instance, if technologies are deemed to be safe but not necessarily effective, we sometimes are duty bound to fund them up to the equivalent of a proven technology to prevent unfair diminishment of the financial worth of a financial product. So I can expand on that further if you wish to. So next slide, please. And this was just a brief slide for me to prompt to say, obviously, as I said before, NICE you would have thought was a potential light in the darkness for this, but unfortunately, despite the wonderful announcements a few years ago about reform and particularly in the ways in which they were perhaps shifting in their agility and their rapidity of their assessments and the types of evidence they were perhaps using in the assessment of devices and the use of expert advice. Unfortunately, in this area, robotic surgery, unfortunately, nothing really has moved forward, in my opinion. Next slide. So in the void that I sometimes feel we sit, we have our medical policy team, which essentially is designed to evaluate the evidence behind various new technologies and really decide whether they're safe and effective. And as I alluded to before, with the luxury of not having to really do the economic analysis of NICE. And very much move towards that through implementation of policy designs, product designs, right the way through to individual claims, and also engaging with external stakeholders such as NICE and Royal Colleges to really sort of say, come on, we need some guidance about X, Y, Z to try and preserve patient safety and the efficacy of these treatments. And we also have a horizon scanning side of things, because there are many of these messy technologies on the horizon. Robotic surgery is not just a one-off, which we can perhaps talk about later. Next slide. So our response very much is surrounded by what we call the patient safety tool. And I think the name is deliberately chosen for that, because that really is its function, to examine the evidence behind new technologies and, in simple terms, to grade them as either green, meaning that they're proven to be safe and effective, amber, which is they're proven to be safe but not necessarily effective. And this is the area where sometimes the financial services regulators encourage us to fund to avoid unfair erosion of financial worth of products. And then there's red, which is either not proven to be safe or worse, proven to be unsafe, and engage providers and individual specialists that engage in this kind of behavior we generally approach, and with a view to terminating our relationship if they don't stop. And this tool was developed by the help of the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine. It's under constant reiteration as we review things and review the kinds of technologies we examine. Next slide. And it's kind of, well, it is underpinned by the concept of evidence-based medicine. And this slide was really just to remind everybody what is evidence-based medicine, because depending on our stage of training, that could mean an awful lot. I mean, I think when I first trained, evidence-based medicine was very much what your consultant said was worked. But then we certainly went through a phase of, if it isn't a randomized controlled trial, then it's useless and we can't know anything. And like most things in life, I think we've probably settled in a better moderate space, which is really the fusion of the best available evidence. And if randomized controlled trials are not available, then we need to look elsewhere. And this is very much the case for robotic surgery. There are very few randomized controlled trials, and the evidence as it is often large repositories of data, often held by the robotic companies themselves. So it's a data-rich area, but not necessarily designed in the traditional scientific sort of trial design. And it's fused with expert opinion, just because experts are not randomized controlled trials. Their views are not necessarily invalid, and they've got a lot of richness of experience, and fused with the views of what our patients are. So it's a fusion of really three things. And patients' views can very much be dependent on the situation they're in. And, you know, obviously, you know, people that are terminally ill, for instance, that have run out of any proven treatments may well decide that they're the evidence bar supporting an experimental treatment that they want to try might well be lower than if they were well and contemplating an optional treatment. And we have to sort of fuse that, factor that into our decision making. Next slide. So the culmination of all of these activities is actually we've started to publish a series of reviews about various specialities in surgical specialities and the use of robots in them. And I think we're now up to about 6 or 7, and they're freely available on our website, because we strongly believe that this is not about just informing AXA health decision making. This is really about stimulating debate and getting our opinions and what we found out into the public domain. So they are, as I say, freely available on our website, and they are indeed a fusion of all the things that I was talking about there with evidence-based medicine, and they're under regular review. Next slide, please. Skip over that to the next one. Yeah, and this was just to say that, this is not unique. There are other things that we're actively monitoring or starting to get involved in all the time with these similar kind of uncertainties. We've got cancer screening, including the rise of liquid biopsies. I don't know whether you've much heard of the GRAIL program within the NHS. Well, we can add another half a dozen of those in the private sector. The rise of pharmacogenetics, the whole issue of artificial intelligence, wearables, tech is a fascinating one, which we are neck deep in wading through. And even the rise of over-the-counter laboratory tests. I don't know whether you appreciate it, but within the year, I suspect they'll be freely able to purchase blood tests and other laboratory tests from supermarket things, which is something that amazed me when I first found out. Next slide, please. And this was just a shameless plug to say that this is our web landing page of the Medical Policy Axe. If you type that in a Google or other search in the internet, you'll find us. And we're more than happy to engage, because we really haven't got all the answers. Our process is not perfect. I'm not perfect. And so really it is about engaging and reaching out across all spectrum, from not only the manufacturers and the scientists that are developing all this clever stuff, right the way through to the specialists that are using it and the providers that are using it. That's all I had, really, unless there's any other questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, John. Sorry, it took me a little bit of time to just get to my unmute button. Really interesting talk. Thank you so much. I think it's such a unique situation, isn't it? And technology is changing all of the time. In our hospital, we have a what we call CDEG, Clinical Development and Evaluation Group, where all new things have to go, and we look at them really carefully. And it feels like quite a robust process, actually. It reassures you. We do have
you, but I find it endlessly fascinating how individual hospital groups end up with different conclusions, and likewise internationally, different nations come up with different conclusions. It's a fascinating thing to contemplate.
Yes, absolutely. So we've got a question in the chat, which I think is very relevant. So from Pete O'Neill, who asks, what are your thoughts on robotic assisted knee replacements and hip replacements?
Fascinating one. I think what is clear from the evidence is that the robot definitely helps you place a prosthesis more accurately. So where you think you want to place it, it will enable you to place it. Whether that makes a blind bit of difference to the patient outcome, and whether their pain is there or whether the joint lasts, is anybody's guess. And I think with that, I think inevitably comes the question, particularly from healthcare providers which are financially constrained, is, well, what value is the additional £2,000 or £3,000 per procedure that it might cost to do with the robot? What is the patient gaining for that value, and could it be spent elsewhere? And at the moment, in general, I don't know whether perhaps anybody else online can contradict me on this, but in general, people are slower as well with the robot in orthopedic surgery. And so, again, it's about theatre time, efficiency, and really what are we using the resources for if the outcomes are no better. But I think it's one of those things that just needs the data. And again, I'm open to not necessarily it being a randomized control data. It's real world data, looking at the what matters to patients, which is their pain and their joint mobility.
Yes, gosh, it's there are so many different factors, aren't there? I know in my specialty, the we can do procedures robotically or even laparoscopically, but the additional time might mean that I could have done 2 cases on the list, but if I choose to do it laparoscopically, I can't afford to put 2 on the list. And in current waiting list situation, that it almost feels wrong at times to not get the maximum number of cases on the list. So it's a real balance. There is one more question. I'm not sure if this is something you can answer, but from Abdunasar Ramadan asking if you could recommend any institution for robotic training in urology. I certainly can't make that recommendation. I don't know if you can, John.
I can't recommend it. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that you know, Intuitive and the original robotic provider in the country is probably the most advanced in the urological field. And at the moment, in general, across all of the surgical robot manufacturers, their own robotic training they remain very close to their own robotic training program. So all of them run very tight accredited training programs themselves with mentorship and proctorship and data collection processes. So at the moment, it's a very tightly run processes the various manufacturers run. So I can't recommend one in any particular, but that's the current state of play, which I don't think anybody would argue with at the moment.
Lovely. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, John. Fascinating to hear your insights. I think we'll move on to our next speaker, if that's okay, but thanks once again. So welcome, Saskia. We're looking forward to hearing about what's new at HSIB. And let me just share my screen. And hang on a second, let me get your talk on the top first. That's always the best way to do it. It's just lots of different buttons to press. Here we go. And hopefully,
yeah, first slide.
Okay,
spoiler alert. We need to go to the first slide.
Yeah, sorry.
So here's my presentation in reverse. So thanks, Harriet. So I'm Saskia Fursland. I'm one of the senior safety investigators at the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch. I've been doing safety investigations for 13 years now, which has gone really quick. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about HSIB and talk about some of the work we're undertaking at the moment. A little bit more about me is I'm not clinical by background. My background is as a human factors specialist. I used to work with the military, predominantly supporting the human factors aspects of military air accident investigations, but also doing lots of proactive flight safety work with them as well. And then I moved across to healthcare 6.5 years ago now, or just over. So that's me. If we could go on to the next slide, please. Brilliant. So I still feel like we're introducing ourselves after all these years, but I thought I'd give a quick overview of who we are, because we feel that sometimes people still don't know in the system. So the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch was established in 2017 as a new body to undertake independent safety investigations of patient safety incidents in NHS-funded care in England. We're currently hosted by NHS England, but note, not for long, although we've been operating functionally separate and independently from them. And from, I believe this is actually our last external presentation as the Healthcare Safety and Investigation Branch, because from October, we will be becoming an arm's length body and be known as the Health Services Safety Investigations Body. And with that, we'll have some new powers, which I'll go over in shortly, that are set out in the Health and Care Act 2022. But we'll have some similarities about how we've been operating all this time. So one of the key aspects of our investigations is that we do not apportion blame or liability. So our investigations use a systems approach, which moves the focus of the investigations away from people and to the wider system. And our purpose is to identify patient safety risks that exist at that systems level. And it's also where we aim to make our recommendations, so that we so that they can then filter down to make improvements across the NHS rather than focusing on individuals or individual trusts, etc. We also intend to professionalise the role of safety investigations. So if we can go on to the next slide, please, Harriet. And we have a very experienced investigation education team, and this slide is slightly outdated because that was as of May 2023. We had 7,243 learners. I think it's over 10,000 now. So, but we offer investigation training courses, which are free to NHS funded care staff. And also that those courses are aligned with the new patient safety incident response framework as well. So hopefully, you know, this work will help towards improving the standards of local investigations across the NHS. We could go to the next slide. So our approach, we've got a really diverse team of investigators and analysts on our investigation team. We've got backgrounds from the NHS, aviation, military investigations, human factors, and other safety critical industries. And we find that really beneficial to, you know, to have those, offer all those different insights into our investigations. And we all have that sort of, I guess, core base level of human factors training and safety science around investigations, with us completing courses at Cranfield University, which is renowned in their safety investigation courses. We're multidisciplinary and inclusive. So during every investigation, we explore clinical and non-clinical perspectives during our field work and analysis. And our investigations are also supported by subject matter advisors and experts by lived experience. And just sort of building on that, it's what's really central to our investigations is the involvement of the patient, the families, and the staff as well. And so that's something that's really important to us. As I mentioned before about the no blame, we provide a confidential space for staff to tell us their experience of patient safety incidents, in the knowledge that we're there to learn and not blame. And I'll cover a little bit more about that in a moment. And we're transparent and collaborative. So our safety recommendations are not enforced by ourselves because we are not a regulator and that is not our role. But we seek to achieve change through transparent and collaborative approach to accountability and looking at how we can develop those accountability mechanisms more to ensure that our recommendations are then translated into meaningful change at a system level. We could go to the next slide. So our organisational transformation. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're going to be becoming the Health Services Safety Investigations body from October. And that new organisation will really look to build on the work that the Healthcare Safety Investigation branch has done since 2017, but look to evolve further and further develop to improve patient safety. Some of the main differences between HSIB and HSSIB are that we'll have a board of executive and non-executive directors whose role is to establish and take forward our strategic aims and objectives, but also be accountable for, you know, the governance and assurance of our operations and our performance. We'll have enhanced powers, so that will require people and organisations to cooperate with our patient and safety investigations, and also enables us to obtain any evidence that we consider to be relevant to our investigations. But what I should add is that with that, we have that increased protection over the information that we gather as well, so that information is provided during an investigation is protected from disclosure. So that means that other bodies are not able to access the information we have unless they have permission through a high court, and that is set out in the Health and Care Act, so it is enshrined in law now. So that's something that's quite powerful. We currently have a maternity investigations programme, but again, as we move to HSIB, we will be separating from that maternity investigations programme, and so they will then be moving and hosted by the Care Quality Commission from October onwards. If we go on to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to talk to you about a couple of pieces of work which I thought might be of interest and potentially relevant to the work you do. So the first is around staff fatigue and patient safety. So earlier this year, we held an event to start the conversation around NHS staff fatigue, and I've popped the link on that slide there. In case you're interested, there is a video that you can go and have a look at. And what we're doing is we're continuing with this work to collect insights and intelligence on this topic area to see if there's potential for an investigation in this area, and if so, what that investigation might look like and how we might do that. So what is fatigue? So fatigue is a physiological state of reduced mental or physical performance capability resulting from sleep loss, extended wakefulness, circadian phase, and or workload, and that can be mental or physical activity. That can impair a person's alertness and ability to perform safety-related operational duties. And we also know that from looking at the research and the science around this, that fatigue can cause a number of various performance detriments. So, for example, a degradation in cognitive performance, such as slow response times, lapses in attention, the reduced ability to switch between tasks and to reliably recall, manipulate, and apply information to solve problems. It can also increase risk-taking behaviour, including delays to decision-making and a greater tendency to be impulsive or adopt strategies that can prioritise short-term gains over long-term success. It can impact on emotional state and perceptions of an individual, so including negative emotions, depression, stress, anxiety and paranoia, which is obviously things we're seeing, in multiple staff surveys of these sort of coming and being expressed as the pressures across the NHS continue to increase, and especially in recent times. Fatigue also reduces the ability to self-regulate and cope and demonstrate empathy towards others, which then can have implications for team working and communication, which, as you know, is fundamental for and really important in the care of patients. And so there is that potential that it can impact on patient care, but also that potential impact on patient safety. And I guess at a more sort of individual level as well, that fatigue can also cause or contribute towards chronic health conditions, and so impact on like the cardiovascular system and increase the risk of some cancers. So fatigue is a significant risk, and it can affect all healthcare staff. And we know that staff fatigue is a risk that's recognised and managed through formal processes in other safety critical industries, and that, like healthcare, these industries involve shift work and the delivery of the 24-hour service. And yeah, while I acknowledge, that there's differences, between those industries, and perhaps the way that fatigue could be managed as well in healthcare, I think there is the potential that more could be learned in healthcare and how to consider and reduce the risk of fatigue. And we don't seem to talk about fatigue in healthcare, and it doesn't seem to be considered in patient safety incidents either. And so therefore that link between fatigue and patient safety is not something that seems to be recognised much in healthcare. So hence this is something why we're looking to understand and explore this a little bit further. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is an ongoing investigation. So this investigation explores the patient safety risk of unintended retained swabs after an invasive procedure. So we launched this investigation following a case where a patient undergoing a coronary artery bypass graft experienced an incident where 2 swabs were unintentionally retained. And I realised that having 2 swabs retained is extremely rare, but I think it goes to show the potential vulnerabilities with the process as it currently stands. So far, we've explored the particular event I described in a bit more detail, and we've also done a thematic analysis of 31 serious incident reports to get an idea of what are some of the most commonly identified themes across this type of event, to help identify, areas that could be explored further. And the results we've drafted an interim report with the findings of that thematic analysis, which we're planning to publish later on this year. So keep your eyes peeled for that. The investigation, it's still ongoing at the moment, where we're looking at alternative safety controls to reduce the likelihood of foreign objects being unintentionally retained. So, for example, we know that some hospitals in America are using radio frequency identification tagging to help track swabs in theatre. So we're exploring that a little bit further, and also I think, as John mentioned earlier, sort of keeping that sort of cost in the back of our mind as well, because we know that that can be one of the key barriers to things being implemented or considered, or technology being taken aboard in healthcare. We're also exploring something that came up in the thematic analysis and through our observation work of theatres over numerous investigations, in fact, around the responsibility and accountability for the swab count and the overall reconciliation process, and that there may be potential confusion or unclear around that accountability and responsibility, and about what that should like and how that plays out in reality, and whether the culture and or norms of practice may influence this. So it's something we're trying to unpick a little bit more. So something we're really keen to engage with theatre staff to talk about their views and, discuss the process and their thoughts about the culture and responsibility and accountability, etc. So I'm hoping, fingers crossed, you're a nice collective audience, and I can put in a little bit of a cheeky plea to get involved. If I can go to the next slide. So I've just popped my email address here. So if you'd like to know more or potentially have a chat with us, and I should highlight, you will remain anonymous if you do wish to speak with us. Likewise, if you have any insights that you'd like to share to support the information we're gathering around staff fatigue as well and patient safety, we'd really love to hear from you. So please do get in touch, or if you've got any other questions that you'd like to direct offline, then please do feel to get in touch. That was all I was going to cover. I don't know how we're doing for time. Oh, I've finished quite early, so I've rattled through that slightly quicker than I anticipated. But yes, happy to answer anything if there's any questions out there.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Saskia. I love hearing about the human factors side of things, because it's so relevant. In fact, I confess I have a yearning to hear about some of your work in the air accident service, but I suppose we can't ask you to talk about that here. Staff fatigue is so important. It really is. So we do have a question here from Professor Narinder Kapoor, who's one of our advisory board members, and he's asked, since staff wellbeing is so closely related to patient safety, do you think there's a case for a parallel body being formed to investigate incidents such as work-related staff deaths or suicide of staff?
Interesting. Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's something we do. That I think that's one of the things I acknowledge. I mean, absolutely, with staff fatigue, it's been reported about the amount of deaths that have occurred with staff, who at the end of their extremely long shift are getting behind the wheel, and it's something that we will you know, if we did do an investigation in this area, it would something that we'd certainly be highlighting. But I think there is, you know, there's certainly something about actually looking at the safety of staff. I mean, I know it's something, there is another investigation we're doing around workforce in the NHS, and I understand that one of the streams, you know, we are looking at this in a little bit more detail, because as we keep coming in up in our investigations recently, that staff well-being and staff safety links to patient safety, and you need to look after your staff to be able to keep your patients safe as well. They're intrinsically linked. So
yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. Happy staff, you are much more likely to have staff that are willing to comply with safety processes that are in place. If they're not strained for whatever reason it might be, then they're more likely to have the time to actually pay good attention to whatever safety process you have put in place. So absolutely vital. So we've got another question in the chat from Keith Conradi. You might know Keith.
Hi, Keith.
Says, thanks, Saskia, really interesting. Under HSIB, how will you decide what things to investigate? Are there going to be any changes to the current process?
Yes, really good question. And yes, there is going to be changes to the current process. So as Keith will know, is that we developed, when we first started out, we develop some initial criteria about how to help us choose and proceed with investigations. And they were based on systemic risk, outcome impact, and whether we feel like the learning potential. So whether we feel as an organisation, us investigating would add value to that domain, because there may be other ongoing work, in which case it's no point repeating work that's already ongoing in the NHS. But yes, absolutely. We've done a lot of work about, as we're building up to HSIB, about how that process will change, and we've already started that process in a way. So we're now trying to be a lot more collaborative with the system about how we engage and start hearing about the key patient safety risks. And there's a lot more work about an engagement. I think early on, I think before, what tended to happen is that an example of a patient safety risk would be referred to us, and then we'd look at it and go, is this something that we see as a wider risk? And then we'd go off and investigate. Whereas actually, I think we're starting a lot broader now. And so, for example, with the workforce investigation, which is now launched and is ongoing, that started very broad with a huge amount of engagement to learn about the safety risk, what the concerns are, to then help shape what the themes that would be explored further within that investigation. And so from that investigation, I think that overall workforce theme has now resulted in 4 investigations, which will then culminate together to produce an overall larger report as well. So I anticipate going forward, there'll be more sort of rather than our really lengthy reports that we've had historically, we're hopefully going to have sort of shorter reports all coming out a little, and then bringing those all together to summarise at the end and make some larger sort of safety recommendations there.
Lovely, thank you, Saskia. We've got 2 questions, one of which I suspect may have quite a short answer, but Professor Kapoor's asked whether the HSIB was involved in the Lucy Letby case, and if you think there might be any such role. I suspect the answer is not your remit, to be honest.
No, absolutely not our remit. We're about learning. We are about improving patient safety. We are not about so anything as in such as the Lucy Letby case, which is a criminal investigation, that we would absolutely leave to the police, and if we came across such thing, would also refer to the police. So that is absolutely not in our remit.
No, I think perhaps the one point that's crossed my mind, having heard quite a lot about that case, I listened to the podcast, I don't know if anyone else has, but you know, there was a delay in picking up the significance of the insulin results. And I wonder if, I'm thinking of your swab investigation, I'm thinking of the fact that, you know, doing the swab count is such an important part of a surgical procedure. We discussed a case actually at this morning's advisory board, and we talked about the concept of a true pause to allow that swab count to happen and to know what they'd found before you started closing the abdomen. Should that be an official sort of step? That's perhaps my idea rather than something we discussed this morning, although we implied it. Should there be perhaps the link to Lucy I can think of, Lucy Letby's case, is that where was the ability to pick up that result? But we digress a little bit, I think.
Yeah, I think obviously that's an individual case, but if we were seeing that as a systemic, wider, big issue, that this is one of the really big concerns that and gnarly problems of the, you know, NHS, that was something that we would tend to take forward. But it has to be, you know, worked out quite a lot, and we'd taken each individual thing and work those up to decide if that's worth something exploring, or is it something that's a little bit too niche. And without knowing more about how common that problem is, I wouldn't be able to comment further.
No, I think you've commented more than enough. Thank you. One final question for you, which comes from Dennis Wilkins, about who says, great to see the HSIB evolving as originally conceived, but then asks, could you say something please about the relationship with the coroners and their courts? No, don't know if that's something you can.
I mean, I know historically there's been you know, there's been some challenges, I think, trying to, you know, as we were establishing ourselves. It is now that we're HSSIB, we hope we have a good relationship with the coroner, but I should highlight there's that prohibition of disclosure, and that includes the coroner. So the information we collect and the evidence we gain, that would not be shared with the coroner. But likewise, actually, we do get a lot of our insights you know, from coroners about some of the patient safety risks and concerns that are out there in the system. So they're absolutely still you know, it's fundamental importance that we do have, you know, relationship with them, likewise the wider system as well, to learn about these patient safety risks and concerns and make sure that our investigations tackle those the absolutely big key concerns, and that we make sure we investigate the right things.
Lovely, thank you. Well, I'm going to say thank you very much and let you off the hook. You've given us a really good insight into HSIB and HSSIB, and I look forward to an ongoing relationship with you with CORESS. And as I say, I'll discuss that case that we shared this morning with you later.
Thank you, Harriet.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And last but not least, we're going to move on to Dr. Mike Devlin, who's going to talk to us about patient safety in a medico-legal context. So let me just share my screen and hopefully we'll get the slides starting off at the beginning this time. And let's get that into screen mode. Thank you very much.
Harriet, thank you very much indeed, and thank you to CORESS for the kind invitation to speak to you this afternoon. I'm Mike Devlin. I've seemed to have been at the MDU forever and ever now. It's 25 years. And if I could just begin by saying it really is an absolute privilege. It's a great job. It's one of the few jobs where you are directly helping colleagues in a way that hopefully will make a difference when you're facing the stresses of various investigations. Next slide, please. This is just a brief overview of things I'd like to cover. Hopefully, if there's sort of time, with a bit of luck, there will be. Starting off with PSERF. It is new, and therefore I just wanted to try and give you a very brief overview of what I think are the main differences with the predecessor framework. The rest you can read. I should add that I would always, in this type of talk, cover HSIB as well. But I'm just delighted to be able to follow Saskia, because she's done that absolutely brilliantly and plainly much better than I ever could. Plus, knowing that Keith is in the audience, I would shudder to think that I'm sort of teaching Keith and others how to suck eggs. But I am going to return to HSIB because I do think they have a pivotal role in the whole patient safety landscape in England at the present time. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So what is it? This is a new framework that was rolled out a year ago and is now meant to be used by every single trust in England as of this month. It applies to secondary care organisations. It will almost certainly be applied on a mandatory basis to primary care organisations in due course, but at the moment that's just a voluntary system. And you'll see it replaces the serious incident framework. And you may recall that at the root of the serious incident framework was this concept of a root cause analysis. And one of the problems with that approach was that there would be an axiomatic expectation that anything that goes wrong has a single cause. And I know with this very specialized audience today, you will know fine well that that's almost never the case. And as our previous speakers have highlighted, there is usually a systems factor in almost everything that we see that presents itself as a patient safety incident. So the two things to emphasize, it's not simply the old serious incident framework with a new CAT badge. This is something that is quite new. Nor is it a framework that prescribes what and how to investigate. There is some flexibility there. Next slide, please. So this is the new philosophy. There are four guiding principles: compassionate engagement and involvement by those affected by patient safety incidents. So those affected include staff, which I'm going to come back to later in this presentation, as well as very obviously the patients and the patient's relatives. And the crucial thing about this for me, and if there's one takeaway learning point, is that it's the application of a range of system-based approaches to learning. It also introduces this concept of a proportionate response to patient safety incidents. So it doesn't say you've got to have a threshold and investigate everything that happens above that threshold. There is a little bit of flexibility that is within that. And lastly, there is something known as supportive oversight. And that essentially means that ICBs are not there to exercise a sort of top-down command and control process, but really they should be supporting organizations to learn and then to share that sort of learning. So they have an important role in helping that to sort of happen, particularly that sharing function. Next slide, please. So I've hinted at a few of these changes, but this is just summarizing it on one slide for you. So as I mentioned, no complex thresholds, although there are still some classes of investigation that will continue to occur based on what they are. So I'll come to that in a sort of later slide. Organizations are obliged to develop a plan, but the guidance is really clear that this isn't a permanent rule. So once you've got a plan in place, it helps guide what you do, but it doesn't dictate what you do. So there's that subtle distinction there. And as I've said, and forgive me for reiterating this point, but it is important. So incidents don't have to be serious in order for you to investigate them, because some of the learning might actually be much lower down the scale of seriousness. And you might develop processes and ideas that linked to sort of low risk situations. So it's a case of leveraging the learning out of the situation. I've mentioned the ICB role, so I won't go over that. But also there is this mindset to do with oversight that I think is quite different. And I like it because it fits into the whole discussion around what the organizational culture is and how it changes and how it improves. So the oversight mindset includes improvement, psychological safety, and curiosity. And I quite like those three principles because I think it says a lot about what organizations should be trying to do. I'm not saying that's what they currently do, but that's what they should be aiming towards. One of the points that the guidance makes out is that one of the key principles, I should say, that the guidance emphasizes is that blame restricts insight. And again, I think that's one of the key takeaways. We've been saying this for years. I know CORESS, HSIB, and other organizations who have existed in the patient safety field have always emphasized that as soon as you start putting people at the center of a blame culture, then all of a sudden people don't want to help support you in investigations. They're reluctant to come to you to give their statements, and there's all kinds of unintended consequences. Next slide, please. So this is, when I first saw this, I had absolutely no idea what it was all about. Like all people these days, I went to Google to find out a little bit more. But to be fair to NHS England, they do have a quick reference guide, which this is taken from this particular diagram. But CIPS, and this diagram is taken from the 2.0 version of CIPS, is a systems engineering process. So what it does is it emphasizes that systems are at the root to how we do work. So the process is the work that we do. So it's the work that's actually done, not the work as designed or perceived or imagined. And what you can see, there are 6 factors at play in the system of work. So you've got the external environment, you've got the tasks, i.e. what people do actually do. You've got the tools and technology, which are surgeons, you're well used to those, the sort of tools in the operating theatre, your instrument sets and so forth. The organizational rules and confines that you work within, so various policies. The internal environment, so that's things like what the state of the theatres and wards are actually like, ventilation, lighting, physical dynamics. But as you can see right at the centre, and intentionally so, are the people. So that's the staff carrying out the work, and indeed the patient who is receiving the care. Next slide, please. And this is just a summary slide. This is mine, so apologies if it does appear somewhat clunky. I tried to distill as much as I could about what is a huge amount of information that NHS England has published on this into one slide. So I mentioned that PSERF doesn't dictate a particular way to look into a particular patient safety incident. And I mentioned this was a new and novel approach where it's looking at systems rather than root causes. And I should add that when NHS England consulted on this several years ago, one of the points that we made as an organisation is that actually, if you want to know about how to investigate patient safety incidents, why don't you go away and see how HSIB does it? And I'm very pleased to say, because it's in their guidance, it does appear that's exactly what they did. And so therefore, I think colleagues at HSIB will recognise some of the techniques that they describe. So, for example, one of them is called after action review. That's something that is not new. Developed by the US military. And it's very good at picking out learning from tasks that have gone wrong. And it involves all those who are involved in the task getting together. One of the phrases that struck me as someone who's ex-army, is that when you go into the review, you leave your stripes outside, i.e. anyone who takes part in the review, you're all equal, your opinions and insights are as valuable as anyone else's. There's no hierarchy there. MDT review, you all know what MDTs are and a crucial part of modern clinical practice. MDT reviews are particularly useful with patient safety incidents in trying to understand how problems that have arisen from work as done, as opposed to work as defined or imagined. I'm not going to say anything about it because I think that's probably quite self-explanatory. Swarm is something that has developed, I think, from some of the project management science. So you might have heard things like scrums that are used in project management. Swarms are things that are used straight after something goes wrong, where you get basically as many of the people who were involved together straight away. So it's before memories decay and people start perhaps feeling a little bit apprehensive about speaking to investigators. So again, it's done by a facilitator who encourages everyone to speak out. And I mentioned that I would also return to patient safety incident investigation. So there still is a formal process for certain types of patient safety incidents. So these are normally deaths that had a clinical feature to them, or a sort of clinical error or mistake that's have led to it. Never events are another category of this. Child deaths are another subcategory. So some things are still investigated in a sort of formal way, and that formal way is to look at what you're starting with, to have a planning phase, and then you have what's called a synthesis phase, which is then looking at the evidence, analysing it, working out what your recommendation is going to be, and so forth. Then moving on to the right-hand side of the screen, I really like this. I like acronyms. So you've got a debriefing tool called SHARE, and you can see from the 5 words why it's called that. And the reason I like this is because in the 25 years that I've been doing this job, one of the constant bits of feedback that I get from doctors is that we like getting involved in patient safety work, but what we don't like is we never hear much about it afterwards. So PSERF, as a general approach, does emphasize that you should debrief after your investigation. So next slide, please. And the next slide, please. Again, I'm grateful to Saskia and for others, and indeed Harriet, for sort of teeing up this idea of the importance of human factors. And we've already heard about tiredness. So with individuals, there are really obvious things there to address as well. So hungry, thirsty, being emotional, stressed are things that will impact on your judgment. There's also things affecting team performance that I think is really equally as sort of interesting. Martin Bromley, if you have never heard him speak, do please seek him out on YouTube, or if you have the chance to hear him in person, please go and listen to him. He's a brilliant speaker, and he talks about his wife who died whilst undergoing an ENT procedure. And the problem was that there was a difficulty in securing the airway, and despite having really expert, really experienced doctors attending his wife, Elaine, what they failed to do was to carry out a tracheostomy at an appropriately early junction. And that is despite the nursing staff actually going and giving a trachea set to the surgeon saying, would you like to use this? And it was just the fact that they were so busy trying to work out why they couldn't intubate Elaine that they couldn't actually stop and think as to what they should be doing next. So Martin Bromley, definitely a name to go away and seek out. Another two names just to give you, because sorry, I'm probably putting my RO hat on here, but one of the things I always like to emphasize with CPD is that hopefully it'll just give you a taster of things that might interest you and you can then go away and sort of read about. One is Matthew Syed, Black Box Thinking, and that emphasizes the importance of a constructive approach, a growth mindset and learning from what goes wrong. And the other is Sydney Decker, who's done a huge amount of work in how organizations should develop a just and learning culture. We don't really have time to go into that, but just to say those are two names you might well want to go and look at and read about a little bit more. Next slide, please. And just to give you some examples of what we've seen here at the MDU, impairments due to drugs and alcohol, that would be, I think, fairly obvious. That's bound to impair you. Gross negligence manslaughter investigations, you might be aware of the leading case of Adamako, and that was indeed an anaesthetist who had alarms going, but it was a Dynamap BP cuff alarm that was going. And he just did not think of the right things to sort of do at the sort of time. But there are other things to do with situational awareness more sort of generally, and knowing instinctively that something's not right, but just not being able to recognize what it is. So not stopping, thinking, taking time, or even indeed taking advice. Switching medications or samples. Good example of that is a crash call to women who need emergency cesarean sections at the same time. Only one doctor available to sort of go and see what's sort of needed. While they're there, they take bloods from each patient, but they get the samples switched before they label them. And fortunately, in this particular case, the patient groups, blood groups were sort of different, and the error was picked up. So therefore, the patients didn't receive the wrong blood in sort of error. But it just shows you that these things can happen really quickly, depending on the internal environment. And you'll all be aware as busy clinicians of the effect of interruptions. Next slide, please. I'm just going to very briefly talk about duty of candour, only to point out that it does help promote learning from patient safety incidents. Next slide, please. It is an ethical and a statutory duty, and I always think of this as a statutory duty sitting within the general broader ethical principle. Next slide, please. That just summarises what the statutory duty is in England. And next slide, please. And this just summarises that when things do go wrong and there's a complaint to the GMC, that mercifully 3/4 don't result any further action. Only 1 in 10 roughly proceeds to a tribunal. Next slide, please. Been very little research into the effects of duty of candour, but why I wanted to include it was that the research that has been done does show that there is an improvement in culture, in organisational culture, which results in net reputational benefits, but no real effect on complaints or litigation rates. And next slide, please. And next slide, please. So you will be aware that a new version of Good Medical Practice is due to come into force at the end of January next year. And this slide just emphasises in the new paragraph 75 and new paragraph 76 that the duties to raise concerns is essentially the same. The language has slightly sort of changed, but it's basically the same. And next slide, please. Just to remind people that there's the freedom to speak up guardian. And what I was really keen to emphasize to this group, because I think most of you are probably senior doctors, it's really useful to be aware of the work of the National Guardian and the local freedom to speak up guardians, to be able to speak to your junior staff about that and support them should they wish to raise concerns themselves. Next slide, please. And what I'd like to emphasize with this particular slide is when doctors do raise concerns, it's so important that they do that in the right way. So work out who the appropriate person is to present your concerns in a factual way. Don't go around telling everyone about it and sending an email to 100 colleagues. That really is not helpful. Much better to act in unison with colleagues. So a group of 10, 15, 20 of you go to senior management with your concerns and be very wary about getting involved in tit-for-tat exchanges. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about the second victim, and this has come up in some of the questions. Albert Wu coined the term over 20 years ago now. Sue Scott, an American researcher, has done a lot of work in this field, and her definition is one I think that most people would accept. And the important thing to remember here is that when doctors are involved in really serious and significant patient safety instance, it does have an effect on you as well as the patient and their family. So hence the sort of second victim. Some studies put the prevalence as high as 60 to 80%. So this is a real problem, and it's why I think we do need to devote some attention to how to support doctors who are caught up in this. Next slide, please. What the papers tend to show is that there are three phases: acute, short-term and long-term. What struck me, and I'm not a psychiatrist, but what struck me is that the reactions described in the academic literature seem to me to be very similar to, for example, acute stress reactions, adjustment reaction for the short-term category, and PTSD for the longer-term category. And that also suggests to me that this is a very real thing. It's not just because someone might be new to the sort of job or be less resilient than a sort of colleague. I think we're all at risk of dropping into these responses. Next slide, please. And this is a shout out for work done by colleagues. I was privileged to be sort of part of this. But Kevin Turner in Bournemouth, a urologist, led the work. And what it puts at its centre is this idea of when there are serious patient safety outcomes. So, for example, deaths on the table. That there is a local framework ready to support individuals, because that early intervention with someone who is local and trusted can be a real game changer. So it's there. That's the website on the RCS England website. Do sort of have a look at it. That might be one of the other things just to sort of take away as another thing to do with your sort of CPD time. Next slide, please. And just to summarize, it's a culture of safety. It has people at its heart. In my view, PSERF, although it's early, seems to be a step in the right direction. Please, as senior doctors, develop the skills you need to take part in incidents. And please do contribute to them, and be curious about things like human factors and how that can impact on the work that you and colleagues do. And the last point, really important point, please do seek support when things go wrong, and please do offer your support to others. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Mike, thank you so much. That was a huge amount of information, and my brain's still assimilating some of it. I've got questions, but I'm also mindful that we're quite close to time. So perhaps we'll take the first one from the chat, which is, why is PSERF not mandatory for private hospitals? I'm not sure if that's a question you can answer, but we'd love it if you could.
It's a really good sort of question. I can't see any reason why it couldn't be adopted by private hospitals. Everything is there. It is freely available. And the tools and techniques, I think, are universal. So my view is that sort of commercial private hospitals could very well use exactly the same techniques.
Lovely, thank you. My question was around duty of candour, which, I mean, absolutely, we must apologise to patients and we must make that process obvious enough to them that they don't come back later and go, but you never said sorry. So they need to be clear that what you've said is an apology, but I've had the experience perhaps from way back where that apology seemed to have happened in terms of the medical staff perspective, but the hospital process was such that a very, very structured standard letter had to be sent as well. And the standard letter felt very inappropriate, actually, because it was so out of a textbook. I don't know if you've got any comments on that about whether there's a right way to do it.
Yes, I agree, and indeed, I saw that Flavie Bradshaw's on the sort of call as well, and she, like I, have been sort of saying a lot about this over the years. I think it's really important to say what you mean. It is, as soon as you start putting weasel words in there, it takes away from the authenticity of what you're trying to say. If you're sorry for what happened, just say that you're sorry for what happened, and that might mean a little bit of pushing back against hospital managers who might be themselves thinking, well, the lawyers will hate this if that's what we say. Well, the lawyers won't sort of hate it. You know, there are provisions in the Compensation Act that mean if you have an apology made in good faith, it's not an admission of liability. So please, an early apology in plain, simple, straightforward language that the patient will understand is the best.
Yes, I totally agree. So we've got 2 more questions, and I think we'll quickly take those questions because lots of people are still here, and then we'll probably need to wrap up, I think. So Professor Kapoor has said, do you have any views on MHPS being overhauled since it's now around 20 years old? And then he has a second question, perhaps one at a time.
Yes, it's certainly, I think if there is an overhaul, it'll be more iterative. When it came in, it certainly surprised us because it was quite a departure from the previous HC99 type procedures. But the developments, for example, in sort of Northern Ireland have been good in that it does allow for a sort of slightly more informal beginning to the investigation. So my view is that a lot of these things can be headed off at the pass. So anything that brings in flexibility is going to be good. And I think that should be the aim.
Lovely, thank you. And the second question was, how do you balance blame and accountability? That's quite a big question, actually. I'm not sure if you can answer that one quickly.
Yeah, as quick as I can. Really good question. I think it is easy for people to be accountable. So if I cause someone's death by something I do, I am accountable for my actions. But it's not necessary for me to be blamed for that, because accountability and blame are different in the sense that blame implies there's culpability, perhaps even criminal culpability for what goes wrong. Whereas what you're really trying to do is what went wrong, why did it go wrong, and how can we prevent a recurrence? So blame prevents that process from happening.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much. And there's just a few other comments in the chat, which is sort of more sort of pick up on what you've said, really. So Keith Conradi says the private hospitals note that independent providers will now fall under the remit of the HSIB. And Flavie Bradshaw from AXA says the large patient groups are implementing PSERF. Sorry, the large private groups are now implementing PSERF. And she totally agrees with your comments about duty of candour. So all in agreement there. Well, I'm going to bring things to a close now because it's now almost 10 to 4. What a fantastic session. Huge thanks to all of our speakers. I know Damien's had to go, but John, Mike, Saskia, you're all here. Thank you so much. Excellent talks, really interesting conversation and chat and questions from everybody. I'd like to just give a shout out for AXA and MDU as our supporters / sponsors. We really appreciate that. CORESS relies on help of organisations such as yourselves, and it would be remiss of me not to say that out loud in front of everybody. We're really grateful for the support you give us as a charity. So thank you for that, and thank you to everybody who's attended today. I hope people enjoy listening to the talks online, which are all accessible, and we're grateful to our speakers for allowing us to record and keep those available for other people. So thank you very, very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a good weekend.
Thank you, Harriet. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.